Okay, hi there and welcome to another video. This time we're going to be taking a look at some of the arguments for and against legalising cannabis in the UK. A classic microeconomic question, if you like, which has some macro aspects as well. One that invites you to think about externalities and cost benefits and all that kind of stuff. Here's a possible question. Assess the argument that legalising cannabis in the UK would lead to an improvement in social welfare. Cannabis is currently in the UK a controlled drug, as classified by the Misuse of Drugs Act in 1971, but GPs now in Britain are allowed to prescribe some cannabis products for medicinal purposes. Canada, of course, was in the news in 2018 when it made the news as becoming the second country after Uruguay to legalise marijuana. Here's a chart showing the cannabis consumption of people in Canada aged 15 years and over. The number of people consuming cannabis daily has increased by almost a factor of 3 since the early 1990s. The rules in Canada are that it varies from province to province, but basically people over the age of 18 are allowed to possess, I think, 30 grams of cannabis in public. And they're also allowed to grow legally up to 4 cannabis plants themselves at home. Cannabis spending last year in Canada was 0.5% of all household spending, quite a sizable amount. Thailand has just recently announced it will allow medicinal use of cannabis, but not recreational use. And in the United States, there are now 12 states where it's now legal to use cannabis in a recreational way. New Mexico just joined Alaska and California and Michigan and Oregon, and according to this chart, California, of course, is the biggest market for recreational cannabis by some distance. It's bigger than several of the other states combined, in fact. So what are some of the arguments for and against legalising cannabis? I think the crucial thing here is to adopt an economic perspective and also to bring into your discussion some of the aspects of externalities. Well, generally, I think that the government is hoping that if you regulate and legalise the market, that's going to allow them to control the safety and the potency of cannabis sold by sellers. But in terms of 3 specific points, many people claim that if you legalise cannabis, you'll get more tax revenue, up to perhaps £1 billion a year on some estimates. And the second point is that it could save several £100 million a year on policing cannabis. There would be presumably a smaller illegal industry, wouldn't be eliminated entirely, and you'd be lowering the burden on the police and criminal justice system from taking people to court. So more tax revenue and a reduced policing costs, falling government spending are 2 benefits. And then of course you could bring in the wider social aspect, the use of cannabis, the social benefits of cannabis used to help people with chronic illness, people suffering from epilepsy, prone to brain seizures, people in the advanced stages of cancer and Parkinson's disease, and also as a treatment for multiple sclerosis. So, there clearly are arguments for legalising cannabis. If you're in favour of legalising, you will tend to focus on the positive externalities rather than the negative externalities. So what this chart does is it kind of accentuates, if you like, the positives. Can you see here that marginal social benefit, MSB, is quite significantly above marginal private benefit? I've put in some negative externalities, but overall, the private optimum point A is to the left of the social optimum point B, in which case you can make a case for saying that legalisation would bring net social benefits, because the external benefits outweigh the external costs. And that kind of diagram, this kind of approach might be used by economists who want to support a change in the law. On the other hand, of course, there are arguments against legalising cannabis. One is the environmental impact. Cannabis actually is a very heavy use of power to power the cannabis farms. I think I was reading somewhere that in California, nearly 3% of all power output is used by cannabis farms. And cannabis is very water intensive as well. So you could make a case for saying that the environmental footprint is substantially negative, and that might worsen if you legalise it. Second point is that particularly amongst adolescents whose brains are not yet fully developed, overuse of cannabis can be harmful for their brain development. There is some evidence, for example, that frequent use of cannabis amongst young people in particular is linked to the inducement of psychosis. And of course, people worry that the use of cannabis is a kind of gateway drug to perhaps more serious and more damaging drug use. Third point is the wider external costs to society of addiction in the long term. So dealing with mental health issues. It is difficult to know exactly the extent of the drug's potential to harm health, but there are issues to do with mental health, perhaps increased risk of cancer. Experts linking, for example, the use of cannabis in teenage years to cases of depression later in life. We often don't see these consequences until much later, decades later. And then there's a wider issue, concerns, for example, about people driving cars and vans under the influence, risk of accidents, and the potential risk of violence in the home. So I suppose this slide is all about, if you like, the negative externalities of cannabis use, and that will be used by people to make the case for not legalising. A couple of examples of, if you like, quite quirky, unintended consequences that this study from the Economic Journal of last year from the University of research by Mike Langdon, arguing that if you live next to a Dutch coffee shop where cannabis is sold legally, your house price is probably going to take a bit of a hit. And here's a lovely study from Michel Baggio, University of Connecticut, published in the Metro newspaper in March 2019, making the case that cannabis can actually lead to a surge in the demand for junk foods. People, as it says there, stoners might go on an epic junk food binge, getting whatever they want, whatever the salt or the sugar they need. So you can make a case for saying that increased cannabis use could lead to increased obesity, which would have health costs and consequences as well. So if you think that cannabis shouldn't be legalised, you are probably going to be drawing an analysis diagram something like this one. Now this time, can you see I've drawn the marginal social cost as diverging quite substantially away from private cost. Big negative externalities. I've put some positive externalities in there, but they're not the same extent. So the private optimum A is to the right of the social optimum B. In this case, there are net social costs, costing society more to consume these units than society is valuing these units. And as a result, you probably might want to consider regulating or not even allowing the legalization of cannabis, particularly for recreational purposes. There's the analysis diagram you can draw. I'm sure you'll be able to build your own evaluations as you go through. Here are three little points you might want to take into account. This is the one I love in theory, but in practice. In theory, you'd expect the price of cannabis to fall because there will be an increase in market supply. But what happens if there's a surge in demand? What happens if there's a major unexpected increase in demand? Then it may be the case that cannabis prices go up and the quantity consumed also goes up. Second problem is common with all externalities issues, and that's the problem of measurement. It's very hard to truly capture accurately all of the external costs and all of the external benefits. It's just pretty much impossible. And even if we were to try to do that, how do we put a price, for example, on human life? How do we put a price on the risk of psychosis and mental health issues, the wider social effects of legalisation? It's very hard to measure the impact in dollars and pounds and pence. And also, many of the impacts, if we made a decision to legalise cannabis, would only become apparent in years, perhaps decades ahead. So how far into the future should be included in the social costs and benefits? Do we, for example, include in our decision the impact of cannabis legislation today on future generations, people who have not yet been born? That's a big issue about the discount rate and about how far into the future we go. Either way, it's a very topical issue. It's one there's a lot of supply and demand analysis and market failure analysis you can use, and also conceivably sort of government failure and regulatory failure issues as well. So it's definitely a topic, if you're interested in this kind of economics, to be reading up on and thinking about how you could use it in the exam.